After 100 years, Indigenous communities in Canada are preparing for the return of sacred artifacts from the Vatican. Since the 1920s, the Vatican Museum has held thousands of cultural items that belong to Indigenous peoples. A century later, the Vatican will reportedly announce the return of the items within weeks, with them set to arrive in Canada by the end of this year. For more on the significance of the return, we're joined by Cody Grote, Assistant Professor of History and Indigenous Studies at Western University. Cody, by the way, is also the chair of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO Memory of the World Advisory Committee. They oversee Canada's most important collections of documentary heritage. Great to have you with us this morning.
Thank you.
Really quickly, before you and I get started, I just want to point out that National Chief Cindy Woodhouse described them not as artifacts, but as living, sacred pieces of culture and ceremonies, and underlines the fact that they have to be returned as invaluable objects. Indigenous communities have been calling on the Vatican to return these for decades. What do we know so far about the items that are coming back?
It's a bit confusing because the Vatican for centuries has really kept their cards quite close about what artifacts and what archival documents they have in their collection, not just relating to Indigenous peoples, but relating to communities around the world. But the items we're mostly discussing today are associated with an exhibit that took place 100 years ago in 1925 in the Vatican. And as part of that exhibit, a catalog was published listing specific artifacts. So that's sort of our starting point for this process, is the items listed in that catalog. And from there, we'll see what else might be in the collection.
You know, with things that are so precious, so delicate, and really invaluable, there is some concern about not only how they're being transported, but who will be there to receive them on the other end.
And I think the quote you said from the National Chief really touches on this issue. To us, these aren't just artifacts that we're going to put behind a glass case. These are ancestors in their own right. They have their own sentience, their own being. So when we repatriate these cultural items, we have to recognize that there's ceremony associated with that. This can't just be a transfer from one box to another to an institution. These are ancestors who need to be welcomed back with ceremony and cultural protocol.
Yeah, you're not just picking up like an Amazon package, right? So there is some concern that this isn't going to a museum, but it's going from church to church, from the Vatican to the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops. How will that process unfold to make sure what you just highlighted is done with ceremony and with the sacred significance attached?
And the Vatican's very intentional in doing that because they don't want to establish a precedent, as they've indicated, of the Vatican as an institution or as a state repatriating items to descendant communities. This is a church-to-church transfer, and then the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops will be donating these, in theory, back to Indigenous peoples. We don't know what that process looks like, but we need to make sure that at all points in the process, Indigenous nations are involved in discussions. And one of the tricky aspects, as we've hinted, is it's hard to clearly identify which descendant communities these cultural items belong to, because when they were taken from community, that respect wasn't really given to label them accordingly.
So interesting. So how are they going to sort out not only which community to return them to, like how will they begin that process? Who will be on hand to make sure that happens?
At this point in time, from my understanding, the Canadian Museum of History is going to serve as a bit of an intermediary. So the items are going to go there, and then there's going to be a process of consultation. Now, that can also raise some flags because the Canadian Museum of History, while it's been working to repatriate some items itself, it is still a Crown corporation, and there's still some hesitancy about fully repatriating items. You know, it's a work in progress for them. So, it can seem like a valid step to have these go to an institution like the Canadian Museum of History as an intermediary, as long as we recognize that that institution is also engaging in these repatriation dialogues, and it's not where necessarily it needs to be either. So it's going to be a long process, it's going to be a slow process, but maybe for this a slow process is also valid.
Cody Grote, great to have you join us this morning, Assistant Professor of History and Indigenous Studies at Western University.
Thank you.
If you like that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed, where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.